Why don't you just save us some time, tell us you do. I wish it was so simple. I wish it was. The truth is, for a long time now, most of 40 years, I've tried to speak the truth as God has revealed it in the Scriptures. And I know that many times I've been able to do that, and sometimes I've come up short. And that's the reality of being a human being. And as Lutherans, you get to decide every week. Does he speak for God this week or not? Does he a little lost in the wilderness? Sometimes that happens. But before we go too far down that road, let's talk about the first epistle of John. That's a very interesting little book. In my Bible, the first epistle of John is three pages long. You could all read that this week easily before Jan sums all of this up next week. This is the third Sunday on this little text, and we'll have one more Sunday next week. And it's because in those 3 pages, John gives a lot of very practical advice to the infant church, advice that speaks eloquently to us today. Now, he has much the same message here as in the Gospel of John. But it's maybe 40 years later, and the context is quite different. In the Gospel of John, everyone in that time agreed that Jesus was a human being, a man. But the question was, does this guy come from God, or does he come from someplace else? So the Gospel of John emphasizes that Jesus was coming from God, that Jesus was divine. Well, 40 years later, it's interesting how things changed. 40 years later, it had gotten to a point where some people had taken that to the nth degree, and they said, well, Jesus is truly divine, but he was just a spirit. He was not a human being. And that became the issue. So, in the Gospel of John says Jesus is truly man, but also truly divine. Here in the first letter of John, it says Jesus is truly divine, yes, but also he was a human being. And so it's just kind of tipped over. You may remember back at the beginning of the Gospel of John, how does it start? It talks about the Word. In the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Everything that was created with Jesus present with God from the very beginning. That's what it's saying. Well, in our letter from 1 John, it says, now he focuses on the embodied Word of God. God present with us in this individual Jesus who has come to be present in a specific way to specific people. And he says that we are called to have an embodied faith, a faith that is active and nurturing for people in our time and in our place. Much of what we're about with the service projects is to try to do that in our time and in our place today. But the epistle shifts the focus from in the beginning was the Word to this Word of life as the Christian message, which has its beginning in the incarnation in Jesus, God present with us in Jesus. And the point of that message is to create in the church, well, the word in Greek is koinonia. We don't use a lot of Greek around here, aren't you glad? I am too, because I hardly remember it anymore. But But koinonia is a very important word. We translate it fellowship, but it means much more. It's much more than having a cookie together after church. It has to do with communion with, being together, being present, being fully in touch between ourselves and our God and between one another. It's that idealized state, that fellowship of unity that should exist in the body of Christ. That is, those times when somebody is really hurting and we're somehow able to be there for them. When we can do that, then God has been active in our life, in our presence. That's what John is saying here. And when that takes place, everyone is nurtured. 1 John recognizes that God speaks an embodied word, which will repeatedly be identified with this great big long word, love. That's it. 2 verses later, after this text ends, you get that next week. She gets the good text, eh? Simply says, God is love. When that's present, that's the message that is genuine and makes a difference in people's lives. And that authentic love that John is talking about is not an abstraction. It comes through, it's not just a feeling, it comes through speech, it comes through action, it comes through our presence with those who are hurting in a particular time and in a particular place. Now, in John's time, there were many messages being told, just like today. You know, God says, and then the message comes forth, right? But he says here in the 4th chapter of his little letter, the basic issue is whether that spiritual claim is genuine, whether it comes from God coming into our world through Jesus, or does it come from someplace else? And that's the decision that we always have to make when we hear somebody say to us, you know, God says. And that divine love that he describes here is not simply an idea. No. It takes tangible form in the life that Jesus lived, in the death that he died. According to John, the death of that human being, Jesus, was the most radical form of love that God could send into our world. It's him putting himself utterly and completely on the line so that we might come closer to him, that we might be invited closer to him by his presence. And then he kind of wraps all of this up by saying that for believers, we face a lot of messages. He calls that the Antichrist. It's not the Antichrist like we've seen in some movies. It will be this dictatorial ruler that's very scary. Now, it's just those who are not following Jesus' way. And it says we will face those situations, that power that is in the world, and we will overcome it, he says. Not incidentally by some kind of apocalyptic destruction, but instead, our victory will come wherever faith is professed and lived out in love. Wherever faith is professed and lived out in love, there the gospel goes forward. So, who speaks for God? How do we decide? Well, back in John's day, the question was, was Jesus truly a human being as well as one who was sent from God? Well, we have other issues today, don't we? We hear all kinds of things. We hear that God is some kind of condemnatory, wrathful being who's ready to punish us and send us to hell every time we do something wrong. That's part of the message we hear out there. We hear the end is near. I remember coming out Saturday morning, ready to go to church back when I was in Ward, and as I went out my front walk, I see two guys coming up my driveway with dress shirts and ties on, and I said, okay to myself. So as they came forward, I said, hi fellas, my name is Dick. What can I do for you? And they said, well, we're just really, really concerned about the state of things. You know, the end is near. And I have to tell you, I didn't feel invited at that point. I guess I felt uncomfortable. I felt challenged, right? I said, okay, my name is Dick Newark. What was your name again? And feeling a bit, obviously that wasn't in their script, and they weren't comfortable with that. But they did tell me who they were, and I said, and I'm a pastor of the Lutheran Church. Who do you guys represent? Again, they were kind of pained. They didn't tell me. And I said, well, thank you, fellas. As I said, I'm a pastor of the Lutheran Church. I know what I believe, and I think I know where you're coming from. Well, you know, we're just very concerned. The end is near. And I said, yeah, I kind of got that from you. Yeah. But I have some things I got to get done. Well, you know, the end is near. And I said, well, fellas, if Jesus comes before tomorrow morning, I won't have to preach, but if he doesn't, I've got to be ready tomorrow morning, you know? And so I went to church, and they went on their way. We hear all these different messages, and how do we sort them out, you know? We hear that Jesus is part of a success call, who showers the faithful with all kinds of riches. I remember back when I was in seminary, one of the guys used to do an imitation of Reverend Ike, who was big in that Philadelphia area back then. So, I don't know if anybody remembers Reverend Ike, but according to my friend, he'd say, put your hand on the radio and I'll send you a blessing. And he'd send me $20, right? And Reverend Ike used to arrive at worship amidst a string of Cadillacs. And he did that because he had this idea that God blessed the faithful. Well, God had blessed him. And that's what he was showing the people by doing that. Then the Crystal Cathedral came along. Same deal, exactly, right? Different color, same deal. Interestingly, the Crystal Cathedral is no longer there as the Crystal Cathedral. That church went under. That family that started it took the money, left the church in a bad way, and that building's been sold off, right? You hear these different messages. That God is the God of this or that. You know, I was at lunch with the fellows on Tuesday, and they were kind of kidding me about my birthday that had just taken place. The fact that I was a year older. And I said to them, you know, one thing that I learn more and more every day as I get older is how little I know. And that created an interesting discussion. We all kind of agreed with that as you get older, you begin to realize how much you don't know. And I think that's the beginning of wisdom. So many of these people that represent, I speak for God, are so sure of everything, right? Remember the guy who had it pegged when the end of the world was coming a few years ago? He worked it out mathematically and through the Bible. Yeah, it's going to end on the 13th of December at 12:43. He's gone. and we're still here. He was really sure. Really, really sure. I tend not to trust people who are really, really, really sure. I think that's the beginning of wisdom, and that's a discernment that is valuable. We see through a glass darkly. We don't see it all perfectly well. The message that John says is legitimate is one of love. God is love, he says. He says, now that there is, excuse me, I'm losing my train of thought here. What he's saying is that God has reached out to us to enable us to love one another. If the message is condemnatory, if it's one where that person is sin, and that person is sin, I gotta say, I'm not believing that. You know? Yes, there is sin in the world. We can point in a lot of different directions to sin. But God is first of all not there to condemn us, but to bring us to wholeness, to bring us to life relationship. And if that's missing from the message, then I think we can dismiss that message as illegitimate. What comes through to us from John is that when we hear the literal translations that have become popular, not only in this country but around the world in our time, of various scriptures, and the guy that stands up and says, I know that this means this, absolutely, you can expect evil to follow. We've seen it again and again. There was a group, ISIS, this week who blew up Jonah's tomb because it was, I don't know, people in some form in their mind. They were sure. The same group has cut off a bunch of people's heads, right? We've seen Christian groups do much the same thing. If it's about condemning someone else, I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. Now, to me, the message comes down to this. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. And this is the love of God. It was made manifest among us in that God sent his only Son, Jesus, into the world so that we might live through him. That's what this tiny little bit of 1 John says. That's the message. God sent his Son, Jesus, into the world to love us into relationship. And that's why we come to the church this day. Not only to hear the word, but to receive that love in a very tactile way. As we come to the table here in just a few minutes, we will come to Jesus with his arms outstretched, eager to embrace each of us, everyone, even though we are broken, even though we are damaged, even though we have sinned. And he says to each of us, yes, I know, and still I love you. Come, child, come to me, come receive the love that is undeserved, that grace of God, that takes you from broken sinner to new life in me. And as we go through this place, Jesus goes with us this day. He will be that counselor, that one who will show us the way. And as we go out into our world, we will live out ourselves. We will live it out by loving the people around us, by picking up those who are in need, by sharing with who does not think that.